Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on spring crop strategies. I'm Jodie Rizet and I'm part of the Sheep Connect SA team. Just a reminder that the information provided in today's webinar is general advice only, and please seek professional advice from your local agronomist or livestock consultant for your situation. Today's webinar does not happen without the support of our funders, and we thank Australian Wool Innovation, South Australian Sheep Industry Fund and the Department of Primary Industries and Regions. Tonight's webinar is also supported by the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program and landscape levies. If you want to know more about Sheep Connect, you can visit our website sheepconnectsa.com.au, or you can follow us on Twitter at sheepconnectsa. Today's webinar is presented by Michael Wurst, who's a senior agronomist with PIRSA, and Daniel Schuppan, who's an animal production specialist with Nutrien Ag Solutions at Jamestown. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, everyone. Tonight we're going to cover off on a range of topics and look at different strategies, looking at a range of options for our crops. So I suppose to start with, what are the options? And we've sort of listed a number, and I'm sure there's probably others. But the main ones I think we're looking at considering tonight are grazing the green crops, looking at options of maybe cutting the better ones or better parts of paddocks for hay, hay freezing and then grazing, leaving them and harvesting for grain. And then the last option is actually leaving the crop to go to grain and then grazing it as a standing crop. So what do we need to consider when we're sort of weighing up each of these different options? So first of all, and I think the most important is we really need to get a handle on the amount of biomass which is present in the paddock, and then what is the hay potential, and can hay actually be made in that paddock? And then the other thing is what is the likely grain yield? And I think you have to be a bit realistic about that and sort of saying, well, given the current stored soil moisture that we've got, and also, I suppose you can take into account the long range forecast, if we can trust the Bureau of Met, and then just come up with a reasonably realistic yield potential. The other thing is how much of the paddock is actually harvestable, given that some of these crops are going to be fairly short. Can you get up above the rocks without doing too much damage to your harvester? And then finally, if you do decide to graze it, how are you going to graze it? Okay, I'll now hand over to Daniel. He's going to cover off on looking at doing some cuts.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Recently I've been running around the paddocks doing a lot of dry matter assessments just to see what we've got out in the paddocks at the moment, and then just try to predict for the next 2 months what's going to happen. But it's also good to assess now and then also assess again at the end of October, so we know how much dry matter we're actually going to summer. So first of all, when assessing our pastures, we need to know that the dry matter percentage. So the nutrients that the animals get, the energy, protein, minerals, etc., is actually in the dry matter, so not the moisture that's in the feed. So from now on going to springtime, it actually does get a little bit tricky. So it is really important to, actually get a sample, and like I've done on the screen there, you'll see an example how to calculate dry matter percentage. So I've got, ideally you want to chop it up and you can dry it in an oven or microwave. And that one there just shows that I had 47 grams wet. When I dried it, I ended up with 7 grams. So if we divide 7 divided by the 47 times by 100, so that sample was 15% dry matter. So a lot of samples I've seen around the place have been sort of that 12 to 15% recently, and that will change going forward the next few weeks as the plants mature and those get longer and warmer, etc. Okay, so the technique I use when measuring how much dry matter is in a crop or sow-on feed that's in rows, and it's pretty clean in between the rows, not many weeds, is the 1 metre row technique. So with that, ideally you want to do about 10 cuts across the paddock. That picture there showing I've done 4 cuts fairly close together, but ideally do representative sample across the paddock. So from that, you get an average of how many grams per 1 metre row. You times that by 100, and then you divide by the row spacings in centimetres, times by 10. Once you know your dry matter percentage, then times it by your dry matter percentage, and that will give you kilos of dry matter per hectare. So that example there, I have got, the 4 cuts averaged 120 grams per 1 metre row. So if I times that by 100, row spacing was 22.5 centimetres, times 10, times the dry matter percentage of 15. So that sample there, of that paddock, come out at 800 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. So that's quite, gives you good accuracy using the 1 metre row technique compared to using a 0.1 metre square. So if you don't want to do some cuts and calculate your dry matters, a few years ago, Grain and Graze come up with some ready reckoners. We've got one there for low rainfall. They're still suggesting there to do 10 cuts across the paddock. And for example, there, if you end up with 1,000 grams for 10 1 metre rows, and you had 25 centimetre row spacing at 13.5% moisture, is approximately 540 kilos of dry matter per hectare. In the higher rainfall zone, they've got a ready reckoner there that works on crops up to the height of 25 centimetres and sowing rates of 80 to 100 kilos per hectare. You can see there for wheat, 1 centimetre in height will give you 60 kilos per hectare. Barley will give you at 1 centimetre of height will 75. And they've got trip there. So that calculation there is based on 17.5 centimetre row spacings. So you will need to add or subtract depending on your row spacings, as it says there. So that's the technique we use for measuring crops.
Okay, so what we want to do now is cover on some trigger points to help with some of these key decisions. And the first one is ground cover. And that's certainly one of the more important ones. So coming up with some percentages or trigger points for ground cover. Next one is what's the current soil moisture level. And then also looking at the long range and the short range weather forecast, and using them to help with the decisions, and hopefully the Bureau of Met get it reasonably right. Then we look at what is the current feed level in pasture paddocks, and also the erosion risk on both your pasture paddocks and also any crop paddocks which you might look at grazing. Then we look at grain and hay yield, and finally the price of both grain and hay. So looking at ground cover, one of the key factors certainly for wind erosion is the height of any stubble or pasture that you've actually got there. And if you have a look at the photograph there in the top right, that's a legume stubble, and you can see there's very not much height there and a lot of cover, and so that's quite exposed. Whereas the bottom left image, although there's not a lot of stubble, it's got quite good coverage, and also a fair bit of the stubble is still anchored. So the erosion risk there is quite a bit lower. As far as water erosion, the percent cover is actually more important. So you need the more sort of cover you've got, the better. And additional factors that you need to take into account is the bulk of material that's there, and as I said, the anchorage. So here's just a diagram which illustrates the benefits of having any height in stubble or pasture residue. And so any material that you've got there is giving protection in the soil for 10 times the distance, or 10 times its height downwind from the wind. So if you've got a stubble which is 10 centimetres high, you're getting protection sort of 1 metre downwind. So looking at some targets, generally we sort of talk about 50% cover and maybe 1,000 kilograms of dry matter, but this is sort of a pretty general sort of a target, and really we need to be probably a little bit more specific, because it's never quite that simple and straightforward. So if you're looking at wind erosion, certainly soil type has a big factor. plays a big factor. And on clay soils, you know, you can probably get away with a lower figure of dry matter soil coverage, so down to maybe 500 kilograms. Whereas if you're on a sandy rise, light sandy rise, you probably need to be up quite a bit higher, and maybe, you know, up close to 2,000. And if you're looking at sort of water erosion, the actual slope of the land is probably more important. So if you're on a gentle slope, then your 1,000 kilograms is probably okay. But on a steep slope, you know, you're going to need quite a bit more. Now, the photo there on the right is one I took last week. And you can see there that, you know, the crops come up fairly patchy, and it's got sort of fairly poor growth. And you're probably starting there, you know, well below 500 kilograms just to start with. So you know, that paddock's going to have real trouble to get enough bulk to give good coverage over the summer. So what's the impacts of any sort of soil erosion that might occur? And you've probably seen some of these figures before, but any 1 millimetre loss in soil is equivalent to 15 tonnes of soil per hectare. And the problem is that when you know, get erosion, you tend to be losing the fine soil particles, and they tend to contain the highest level of nutrients. And, you know, most of your nutrients are in that top 10 centimetres. And so if you lose, you know, 1 millimetre of soil, you're losing maybe 2 to 3% of your soil nutrients. So other trigger points that we probably need to look at is soil moisture. And certainly if you've got low soil moisture at the moment, you know, if you do decide to graze a crop, I mean, you have to take into account that there won't be the moisture there for it to regrow. So that's certainly going to expose it to erosion sort of to going forward. So maybe, you know, in that particular case, it might be best to actually leave it and just, you know, hopefully we get some more rain in spring, that it will actually grow and get more bulk, or otherwise sort of leave it and harvest what you can get. However, if you've got, you know, moderate to high soil moisture levels, your options are more open. So you could either graze it, you know, maybe in the better parts, cut it for hay, or even leave it for grain. So the next trigger point is sort of the weather forecast. And at the moment, the Bureau of Meteorology is being pretty confident about spring and certainly September. You know, they're sort of saying there's an 80% chance of average to above average rainfall in September. And for that September to November period, there's, you know, a 60 to 80% chance of above average, depending on where you are in the state. So it's looking pretty promising. However, you know, there is still that 20 or 30% chance that it will be average or below average. So I think we have to hope for the best and maybe plan for the worst. As far as the amount of pasture feed we have currently got, we need to also factor that in. So if you've got low levels, then obviously the grain crops are going to be fairly useful to maybe fill any feed gap. However, if you've still got moderate pasture feed, well, hopefully we can sort of rely on them for a bit longer yet before we need to look at other options. One of the other trigger points is also the erosion risk of the pasture paddocks, and also, I suppose, the crop paddocks which you may look at grazing. So hay yield is also a thing that you need to take into account, and I think you need to look at, you know, a minimum of 1.5 tonnes per hectare of dry matter. So I think anything less than that, you're going to get too high losses, and you're just not going to be able to achieve a reasonable windrow to actually get a decent sort of or pick up to get it into the bale. I suppose one of the advantages we have had a bit of rain. Not everywhere has had good rain in August, but some areas have. And some of the crops that were stressed have actually now started to push out late tillers, and hopefully that will increase the dry matter and even maybe the yield potential of those crops. So looking at grain yield, which is another trigger point, is have a look at what has been the impact of that August rainfall. Have we had enough rainfall in August to actually allow those crops to recover, or are they still struggling? And then finally, what's the grain, hay, and price? So wheat price is still not too bad, but certainly the barley price is fairly disappointing, to say the least. And so that's probably the crop that most people will be looking at to graze or cut for hay, given the relatively low grain price. And at the moment, the hay price is probably even higher than what the current barley price is. So what we thought we'd do now is just have a quick look at some of the economics of a few of these different options, and we'll start with sort of harvesting. And the top row there is looking at the potential yields, and hopefully we're sort of more to the right rather than to the left. And if we look at barley at say $200 a tonne, so certainly it's not too exciting at 0.4 tonnes per hectare. But I suppose one thing is that the lower fuel price will mean that the harvesting costs are probably lower this year than they have been for a while. And then we just need to take into account freight either to the silo, or if you're going to keep it on farm and feed it, well then you haven't got that freight. But certainly those figures at the bottom are sort of the benefit of the option. So we haven't taken into account obviously the establishment or any of the herbicide costs. So just the harvesting costs. So we can look at it from here on in, whether we harvest it or cut it for hay. So I won't spend too much time on this. I'll move on now to look at the hay option, and then we can always come back if there's any questions later on. We can come back and look at these figures in a bit more detail. So moving on to the hay, what I've done with the first two columns is try to look at compare them with the previous two columns in the grain table. So 1 tonne of dry matter should give you close to 400 kilograms of grain, and with the hay, hopefully if all goes well, you should get half a tonne, but depends how much you lose during the hay process. Sometimes you might lose more than half a tonne in those low yielding situations. Now the current hay price is somewhere between $200 and $250 a tonne, depending on the quality of the hay. So I've picked a figure in between of 230, and you can see there that we're looking at $115 a tonne. And then the rest of the figures we've just used is contract rates. So they're probably on the high side, and if you've got your own equipment, and certainly at least some of it, you'll certainly be able to reduce those costs down quite a bit. So you can see at the bottom there, the benefit for hay at that low dry matter yields is not very exciting at all. And certainly, harvest would be a better option, or even grazing at that low dry matter level. Whereas once you get to 1.5 tonne, you should be able to get 1 tonne of hay, and you're actually looking at a better return for hay at that 1.5 tonne level than you would be for grain. And then as you go up, probably the returns for hay would be better. Okay, I now might hand over to Daniel, and he's going to sort of look at the grazing options.
Yeah, it's a lot harder to work out the economics of and returns of grazing a paddock. But if we look at, we do some basic feed budgeting, we allocate 1 kilo of green dry matter per DSC per day as a good rule of thumb and simple feed budgeting. When it comes to once the feed is dried off, rule of thumb, once again, we use 1.5 kilos of dry matter or dry matter per DSC per day. That does get a little bit difficult depending on the fibre levels. And I've had dry vetch paddocks that I've done calculations on. We've had intake and wastage of up to 10 kilos of dry matter per day. So a lot more wastage depending on the quality of that dry feed. So if we look at a simple feed budget here, if we've got a barley paddock at the moment that has 800 kilos of dry matter, if we predict it's going to grow at 10 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day for the next 30 days, depending on rainfall, and then we want to leave 500 kilos behind once we finish grazing that paddock in 30 days. So the feed available in that paddock is the 500 kilos plus 300. So we're looking at about 800, well, still around that 800 kilos of feed available. So if we have ewes and lambs at foot rated at 3 DSC per unit, allocating that 1 kilo dry green matter per DSC, it's 90 kilos dry matter over 30 days. So if we've got 800 kilos there available to that animal, and 90 kilos per unit, so we can stock at about 9 ewes per hectare. So we put some dollar figures on Grazing Green cereal. So there's 100, well, this example here is just 100 hectare paddock, Grazing Green. So the dry matter on offer I've got there is 1,000, 1,500 and 2,000 kilos, so similar to Michael. We want to leave 500 kilos there for ground cover. So the dry matter available, we've got 500, 1,000, 1,500. If we allocate 1 kilo of green dry matter per DSC per day, we have 500 available, 1,000 and 1,500. So total DSC grazing days for a 100 hectare paddock is 50,000, 100,000, 150,000 DSC days. So if we stock that 100 hectare paddock and we used our rule of thumb at a kilo of green dry matter per DSC, stocked it at 500 DSC or 416 dry 60 kilo ewes, that paddock should give us 100 days of grazing, 1,000 kilos on offer at 1,500, 200 and 2,300. So a lot of available days grazing, and that's assuming it's not growing anymore either. So I guess there's a number of ways we can actually value that grazing. We can work it out based on weight gain. If you've got finishing some lambs on there, we can work out weight gain. We can work out an average stocking rate across that 12-month period for that paddock, and then work out your gross margin per DSC and work out a stocking rate or return that way. But what I've done here in this example is just say, well, okay, if our pastures run out, we don't have feed in the paddock, we either sell our stock or we need to confine them. If we had to confine those stock for 100 days, I've worked on roughly 20 cents per head per day. So if we decided to graze that paddock instead of confining, that's going to return about $100 per hectare, $200 for the 1,500 and 300 for the 2,000. But realistically, we know that if we just stock that paddock, you're not going to get that 100 days. So the ideal is that 1 kilo. I've sort of estimated that, okay, well, if those ewes eat more because it's really high quality feed, they'll put on a lot of weight. They might be intaking wastage 2.5 kilograms of dry matter per day. So that means you're going to get less grazing days. You're probably back around that 40 days for 1,000 kilos, 80 days for 1,500 and 120 days for 2 tonne of dry matter per hectare. So you can see the returns there. We could be sitting somewhere in the range of $40 to $100 a hectare, best case scenario, or for 1,500 kilos of dry matter, 80 to 200. So I guess that sort of compares to that hay and grain. If we look at then, can we reduce that wastage by controlled grazing? So I've just said, well, okay, if they waste and intake 4.5 kilos a day, within that 100 hectare paddock for over 400 ewes, it's only going to give us 22 days and up to 67 days for 2 tonne. But if we split that paddock in 4, there's a cost involved, which I'll look at later, but you're back to, if we can get that back to 2.5 kilos of intake and wastage, we're going to get 40 days. So the extra value of grazing there another 18 days gives us another $1,800 or $3,500 for 1,500 and 5,000 for 2 tonne. So yeah, if that's based on Grazing Green. If we move on to looking at if we don't harvest that crop and we have a standing crop there, what value can we put on there? Once again, we've got grain yields of 400 kilos, 600 kilos and 1 tonne. We still want to maintain that ground cover of 500 kilos. And then with our, what I do with grain, standing crops and grain, I allocate about 1 kilo of grain per head per day. Some they'll eat less and some will eat more. So you can see there for 400 kilos of grain, we've got 400 grazing days per head per hectare. For 100 hectare paddock, that's 40,000 days. So, for example, if you had 400 ewes, we're going to get 100 days. So, same equivalent. If we had to lock those stock up rather than having grazing in the paddock, we're looking at somewhere. Well, if the intake and weight's 2 kilos versus the one that I've allocated, we're probably back down to $48 or $50 per hectare. For a 400 kilo yield. For 600 kilos, about 70 to 120. And if there's 1 tonne of grain, then our returns sort of that 120 to 200. So, and the same thing, I've done the same example down the bottom, that by splitting the paddock into 4 and getting better grazing, that we can actually increase our returns. And the one there, by splitting the paddock up, we can get an extra, for 400 kilos of grain, we can get an extra sort of 24,000 grazing days, which is valued at about $4,000 to $5,000. And if there's more grain on offer, you can see that we're going to get a lot more extra grazing days and an extra sort of $12,000 return by actually splitting that paddock up with some temporary electric fencing and improving your grazing management. So if you decide to graze the paddocks and go ahead, we need to obviously look at some animal health considerations. Firstly, make sure they're vaccinated for pulpy kidney that sort of 10 to 14 days prior to going in to your green cereals at the moment, even your spray topped, and when there is grain in the head. And just remember, your pulpy kidney only gives you 3 months protection. So make sure you're up to date on your pulpy kidney vaccine. Also be aware of withholding periods. If you have sprayed any chemicals on those paddocks recently, especially fungicides, just be aware there is some long withholding periods there. We need to balance the minerals. So particularly on cereals that generally, rule of thumb, when they're green, they're deficient in calcium, magnesium, salt, and the same when you're grazing that cereal, the grain. So make sure you get your minerals out of the balance. You'll definitely pick up your growth rates by doing so. So the other one too, if we do graze that standing crop, we need to avoid acidosis. So there's a real risk of grain poisoning there. We need to make sure you trail feed or you do a grain introduction for that week to 2 weeks prior. Try to build up to at least either side of 800 grams per head or more, because those sheep could go into that paddock and eat a kilo plus. And if you want to be a safe option too, you might have a loose lick in there with a buffer in there, such as acid buff. And finally, if you have just recently put some urea out after the last rain, just make sure that you don't graze within 21 days of applying nitrogen, just to avoid a nitrate poisoning. So if we look at the feed quality, that green feed or green crop there at the moment, that's going to be sitting at around 12 ME, probably over 20% protein, and NDF around either side of 40%, really high quality. As we go into springtime, that crop wants to mature, that feed quality is going to start to drop out. If we move on to the dry feed slide there, the left-hand side that's been grazed heavily, that just, the producer there emptied a tank of, boom spray there, done a quick strip up the end of the paddock, just emptied it out. So that was hay frozen or spray top. And you can see there, that would have stayed around that sort of 9 to 10 ME, maybe an NDF of 45-ish, protein 10 to 12%. And you can see that, that lower fibre, the sheep went into that paddock and grazed that out first before, on the right-hand side of that strip there, that just was left to grain. So the sheep ate the spray top before they went into the grain, and then they eventually got onto the grain in the heads. So the grain in the heads will be sitting up over 13 ME. Protein may vary from 12 to 15%. NDF of that dry feed there might be still 70-odd%, hence why they haven't eaten it. So yeah, if we look at that, the value in that standing crop is actually the grain. So I guess you just got to get your head around, well, yeah, doing your feed plan going forward. Do we graze and put some pressure on some green crop at the moment, utilise it green until we get to our ground cover targets? Do we spray top a portion of our crop to hay freeze it, or do we let some go to standing crop? So there's options there. I guess if we look at letting it go to standing crop, we have potential of mice, weathering, kangaroos, etc. So even at low yields, do we actually harvest that grain and put it in the silo and lock a sheep up and confine them? Is there more efficiencies there than actually grazing that standing crop? So when we look at our grazing management and getting good utilisation of that paddock feed going into summer, water is critical. So the number one thing is get that water right. Water location is critical, and I won't talk about too much tonight, but if you can't get the water in the centre of the paddock to get good grazing, make sure it's sort of halfway along the fence line so you can get that natural grazing up. So location is really important, and yeah, pick a suitable area that heavier soil in the paddock that's not going to blow away. So the second photo there, make sure you have really good flow rates in your troughs. You don't need big troughs, you don't need to store water in troughs, but need cool, clean water and flow rate. So that tank there's got a little header tank with a 2-inch pipe out and get plenty of flow there. And finally, if you need to change your location, your paddock, or use temporary electric fencing and want to do some strip grazing to improve your grazing efficiency, we might have to have a pipe down the side of the paddock or different spots throughout the paddock you can tee off, or it's not always good to cart water, but you may have to change that grazing location by having some mobile water tanks to change the location in the paddock. So if we look at our grazing management, it's really important to understand the difference between stocking rate and stocking pressure. So if we go back to our 100-hectare paddock, if we have 600 DSE in there, for example, 200 ewes with lambs at foot, if we've got our paddock, if our ewes and lambs in the paddock, 100 hectares, the stocking rate is going to be 6 DSE and the stocking pressure is 6 DSE. If I then split the paddock in half with electric fencing, and it turns into a 50-hectare paddock, the stocking rate for that 100 hectares is still 6 DSE, but the stocking pressure goes up to 12. And if I go even further, split it into a 25-hectare paddock, the stocking rate goes still to 6 DSE and the stocking pressure goes up to 24 DSE. So that stocking pressure just allows for less selective grazing, getting more of an even graze, less wastage, less trampling, so less patching. So it's really important to get higher stocking pressure. Lower rainfall, yeah, that sort of 25, 50 DSE is good. Once we get to higher rainfall, we can sort of push up to 100 DSE per hectare to get some really good grazing efficiency and stocking rate. This is just a paddock we set up last year, split into 4 paddock with electric fencing. I've got some NDVI images there. The first image on the left is before it was fenced. We can see some grazing there, a bit patchy. Some of that may be due to soil type, etc. The second image is after we split the paddock up. The red part of those images show low leaf area or low biomass, and then the green is high. So you can see there the first quarter that we grazed after grazing was really red, and the other 3 areas got darker. And then I'll just put one example there. The last one on the right hand side is the 4th cell that we grazed, and you can see that the first cell has recovered. So whereas it would have been a lot different if we didn't split that paddock up and get good stocking pressure on there. Once again, yes, I've just mentioned about paddock size. So your larger paddocks, we can look at splitting them up with electric fencing. We might split the paddock up, or we might take sand hills out and graze the flats, or vice versa, or corners of the paddock where they're camping and overgrazing. So we can use that temporary electric fencing in different ways. So I've just put their estimated cost for 2 kilometres of temporary electric fencing. Now that includes your solar energizer, tread-ins, some braided wire, your reels. It's going to cost you about $5,700 to set that up. But as I tried to demonstrate in my figures earlier, that cost can be soon recovered by the extra grazing days that you can actually get in the paddock. So that doesn't include labour, but as Michael pointed out earlier, what is your soil worth? So I prefer to keep that soil in the paddock. So finally, just a couple case studies, couple examples. This one we set up 2 mobs of 395 ewes, both one paddock, well, both approximately 165 hectares in area. So the set stock was one paddock. On the right-hand side, approximately 165 hectares in 2 paddocks, and they were shifted weekly. So they were in there from the 22nd of February to the 19th of March. So when we went out and had a look around the paddock, in the set stock paddock on the left, a lot of the sandy areas were camped on, bared out. There was bared out around the trough, and you could see tracking into the trough. Whereas on the right-hand side, those sheep were shifted every week, back and forth from side to side paddock. When driving around, the sandier rises and the sand hills weren't camped on, weren't bared out, and as you can see there, they were drinking because they were still alive, but you can't see the tracks coming into the troughs there. So just a simple 1 week rotation there made a big difference in that example. And the final one here, this one here, once again, paddock on the left was set stock with 200 ewes from 27th of December to the 19th of February. And the right-hand side, we split that paddock in half and had 245 lambs, so a few more feet in there. And they were rotated from side to side every 1 to 2 weeks. We actually got 19 extra days grazing there, and you can see the difference in cover. So the paddock on the left, the producer said there, the sheep started at one end of the paddock, walked all the way to end to have a drink of water, walked all the way back where they started from, and then started grazing. So you can see there's a big difference there in feed utilisation and trampling and ground cover. So I guess I rule of thumb, once again, I do like a sort of a one week graze. That way stock don't get any bad habits, move them on to the next paddock. And you can always come around in your rotations, and you might still graze that paddock 2 to 3 times in 1 week blocks, rather than absolutely flog it out in a 3 to 4 week period. So hopefully just giving you some things to start thinking about back home, how you can improve your grazing management. There's big differences in management and feed utilisation to keep cover. So like I said, I don't think we should blame the sheep for having bare paddocks. It's the way we manage it, and there's plenty of options how we can manage it.
Summary, what we need to do is to assess, I suppose, how much dry matter is actually in the paddock. So that's the first thing we need to do. And then we need to set the ground cover targets. And I suppose the other thing is Daniel said, we need to be disciplined about that and make sure that we don't overgraze, and make sure that we've got enough ground cover there to protect the soil. And then finally, we need to create a feed plan to make sure that we get through to the next season. So as we've sort of outlined, and hopefully we've given a few options there tonight, we'll either graze some green, look at maybe cutting some hay, harvest some, and then also maybe even look at harvest some standing crop, but make sure we remove the stock from those paddocks before they actually reach those ground cover targets, and then we may need to put them into containment feed. Okay, so thank you, Jody. I'll hand back to you.
A couple of questions. Daniel, you flicked through how to do the dry matter cuts in the rows. Is there a good source if producers want to go back and just revisit that, where they could get some further information on how to do those calculations?
Yeah, Jody, I think I haven't actually got a direct location to find that. You should be able to. I did see one on the New South Wales website had a similar equation that came up with a similar answer. But yeah, whether I'm not sure Michael might know exactly, but sorry, I don't.
I'll take that on notice, and maybe we'll put something up on the Sheep Connect website. I'll make sure we get some information on how to do those cuts and do those calculations from in crop and with quadrats. Yep, great. All right. Another question here for you, Daniel. What class of stock would be best used for grazing those green crops? Like, would you put your weaning lambs on them, or which class of stock would you use?
Yeah, good question, Jody. I think we've got to prioritise. So, yeah, we've got that really high quality feed there at the moment, which we can finish our lambs on and put some weight onto the weaners. Depends on your target market. Are they first cross lambs that are going to go on the next month? We want to continue to maximise their growth rate and turn them off. Are they weaners that we want to get some weight into before the summer? And then I guess too, we've got to look at our ewes and preparing the ewes for joining again. So we might have 20-30% of our ewes at the moment that may be sitting either side score 2.5, and we're going to get some weight back on them pre-joining if you're sort of joining November, December onwards. So yeah, we do got to prioritise. I would prioritise that. Yeah, definitely prioritise it to our young stock and weaners at the moment. And then maybe use that on lighter condition score that those ewes might have had twins and yeah, produced your 2 lambs. We're going to get them up for joining again.
Yep, fantastic. Another question here for you, Daniel. You're under the spotlight tonight. You talked about stocking pressures in that illustration you had with your 4 paddocks. What would you be, if you're grazing green crops or dry crops, what would be your recommended stocking pressures? I think we had 24 in some of those images. What would be your recommendation?
Yeah, like I said, I did mention, I think probably that sort of, yeah, potentially 25 to 40 DSE in the lower rainfall environments. We can definitely push that higher in the higher rainfall environments, and well, probably comes back to your soil type too. The lighter soil too, we can't probably push it as hard, and it'll depend how much cover there is. So there's no hard and fast rule. Yeah, you've got to work out. Really got to work out, well, how long do you want them in that paddock for? How big's the mob? How long is it going to last? Or we want to remove half that feed in 2 weeks. Well, how big a mob we need to do? So I've got a couple of different templates and budgeting, and so good calculators online that you can actually work out, well, yeah, how many sheep do I need in this paddock for how long? Yeah, so I guess the higher the stocking pressure, the more even the graze. You got to remember, but then also just always keep in the back of your mind, once you start running higher stocking pressures, things can go pear-shaped really quickly. So you got to really keep an eye on the management. Like at low stocking rates, a few sheep in a paddock, it takes a lot longer to utilise that dry matter, and you can see it coming with, if you leave stock in a paddock at high stocking pressures for a couple of days too long, you're going to regret it going forward over the summer. So yeah, there's no hard and fast rule, but generally high stocking pressures give you more even graze.
I might add to that, consider the water too, that those high stocking pressures need too, because you often underestimate how much flow you need, would be my addition.
Yeah, so I recommend there that flow rate, probably at least 1 litre per second, if not more. And that should cover off for most mob sizes.
Fantastic. Excellent. There's a question here again for you, Daniel, about your one of the photographs that you had. So at what time of year or growth of the crop were the images of the grazed crop split in 4 taken? So you had that with the green crop with electric fence. When was that done?
Oh, with the NDVI Images?
Yes.
I think that, yeah, I'd have to look up. I did have the dates, but I didn't put them in the presentation. Yeah, I think it might have been back in, this time, well, probably August last year, I think. So, yeah, we took it like right through from July right through September, October.
Sorry, we're referring to satellite images. Sorry, I had the wrong photo.
Yeah.
So it's the same one.
Yep. So those ones were taken in, winter to spring last year. So I only pulled out a few of them. We had a whole heap. So it's more just to give you an example, the imaging, what we can do, and just looking at the images after we did put the fences in and grazed, got that high pressure up and grazed them for short durations.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you for that, Daniel. Thank you to everyone who joined today's webinar. I'd like to thank our funders, Australian Wool Innovation, Department of Primary Industries and Regions, the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund, and the support that we had for today's webinar from Murray Lands and Riverland Landscape Board through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program and Landscape Levies. I'd also like to thank Michael and Daniel for sharing their expertise and experiences. If you should have any additional questions, please contact myself or one of our speakers. Thank you for your time and have a lovely day.